June 19, 1944, less than 2 weeks after D-Day, the English Channel unleashed a fury that almost killed the invasion before it could truly begin. Imagine this: 20-foot waves, a gray, churning chaos, smashing against the Normandy coast. This wasn't just a storm. It was the worst June gale in 40 years, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the Allied supply line. The brand new, man-made harbor off Omaha Beach, codenamed Mulberry A. You can almost hear the gut-wrenching shriek of metal. Massive 6,000-ton concrete caissons, the very bones of this artificial port, were being lifted and dropped by the sea like pebbles. Steel roadways, designed to flex with the tide, were twisted into grotesque sculptures. Landing craft, loaded with precious cargo, were tossed ashore, wrecked and broken. For 3 days the storm raged. Men, soaked and freezing, scrambled across bucking pontoons, fighting a losing battle against the ocean. They watched as sections of their miraculous harbor, a project years in the making, were ripped apart and swallowed by the waves. Then, silence. As the storm receded, the true scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. Mulberry A was gone, destroyed, wrecked beyond repair. And with it, the lifeline for hundreds of thousands of soldiers pushing inland. The Allied armies were a voracious beast, consuming thousands of tons of supplies every single day. Fuel for the tanks, shells for the artillery, bullets for the rifles, food for the men. Without a port, that beast would starve. The entire timetable for Operation Overlord, the liberation of Europe, was now hanging by a thread. The Germans were fiercely defending every hedgerow in Normandy, and the major ports like Cherbourg were either still in enemy hands or had been demolished and mined. The Allies had bet everything on building their own harbor, and the sea had just called their bluff. So, how do you supply the largest invasion in history when you have no port and the ocean itself is trying to send you home? The answer lay not with generals in distant headquarters, but with the men on the ground. Picture them now: Seabees from the US Navy and soldiers from the Army Engineer Special Brigades. They're not clean, they're not rested. They are sunburned, exhausted, their hands raw, standing amidst the wreckage. All around them are crates of simple, modular steel boxes, pontoons, and grease pencil sketches on damp plywood, the ink bleeding from the sea spray. They're staring at the ruins of a brilliant, complex idea. The Mulberry Harbor was supposed to be a triumph of engineering. Giant hollow concrete caissons called phoenixes would be sunk to form a breakwater. A line of old ships, the gooseberries, would be scuttled to provide more shelter. Floating piers called spuds would rise and fall with the tide, connected to the shore by miles of floating steel roadways known as whales. It was a city on the sea, and now it was a graveyard of steel and concrete. The sheer ambition of it was matched only by the totality of its failure at Omaha. But in the midst of this despair, a different kind of thinking started to take hold. As one of those exhausted engineers looked out at the churning water and the mangled remains of their grand plan, a new idea sparked. It was a thought born of desperation and ingenuity. It wasn't spoken in a planning room. It was muttered over the roar of the surf. If the ocean won't hold still, he might have said, then the harbor has to move with it. Forget the massive, rigid structures. Forget trying to fight the sea. What if they could work asterisk with asterisk it? What if they could build a new, smaller, more flexible harbor, not in months, but in hours? The challenge was laid down, unspoken but understood by every engineer and Seabee on that beach. Using nothing but what they had, those simple steel pontoons, ropes, anchors, and sheer nerve, they had to create a working port from scratch. The clock was ticking. They had 24 hours. The fate of the war in Europe depended on what they did next. The storm has finally broken. On the first calm evening, inside the cramped, salt-soaked wardroom of a listing LST, the air is thick with the smell of wet steel and exhaustion. Commanders huddle around a mess table, their shoulders nearly touching. A single bare bulb swings overhead, casting long shadows across a damp nautical chart spread out before them. The decision is made, quiet but absolute. Mulberry A is gone, a ghost on the seafloor. They won't rebuild it. They'll improvise. They'll build something the tide can't simply tear apart again. The plan isn't laid out in neat diagrams. It's a desperate scramble born from necessity. The heroes of this new chapter are the Navy's Seabees and their unsung marvel, the pontoon cube. Picture it. Rugged, 5 by 7 foot hollow steel boxes. They're like giant, indestructible Lego bricks. Pin them together, and you have a raft. Pin more and you have a barge. Keep going and you have a floating causeway, a steel ribbon connecting ship to shore. These aren't just spare parts. They're the building blocks of salvation. The strategy is to create a living pier, one that breathes with the ocean. At the seaward end, they'll sink specialized pier heads, massive platforms mounted on thick steel legs called spuds. These spuds can be raised and lowered, allowing the entire pier head to ride up and down with the swell, a mechanical beast taming the waves. From these spud-legged platforms, they'll run the pontoon causeways all the way to the sand. Out on the water, the work is immediate and relentless. The massive Rhino ferries, those self-propelled pontoon barges that carried the first tanks ashore, are being refueled and relashed. They're no longer just landing craft. They're floating cranes, tugboats, and work platforms. The blockships, those old vessels scuttled to form the original breakwater, still form a ragged line, a partial shield against the ocean's lingering anger. The sea is quieter, but it's still rolling, a constant, heavy presence that reminds everyone of its power. To build this new harbor, they raid their own inventories. It's a process of organized cannibalism. Engineers and Seabees move through a junkyard of wrecked equipment, their hands greasy and torn. They unbolt steel plates from shattered LSTs, scavenge connectors from broken-down vehicles, and pry winches from anything that isn't moving. In the near-total darkness, they learn to select the right pins. And bolts by feel alone, their fingers reading the threads and shapes of the hardware that will hold their world together. But friction grinds against ingenuity. An infantry quartermaster, his face a mask of desperation, corners a Navy lieutenant, demanding to know when he can get his ammunition ashore. He doesn't care about pontoons. He cares about the 10,000 rounds his division needs by morning. Skippers of the remaining LSTs, Homans who have already seen sister ships broken on the sand, are refusing orders to bring their vessels back into the surf. Rumors fly up and down the beach like gulls on the wind. The landings have failed. The beachheads are collapsing. We're being pulled back to England. Amid the doubt and the chaos, the engineers hold on to a simple mantra, whispered over the noise of diesel engines and the crash of waves. Fight the tide. Use the tide. They can't stop the massive force of the English Channel, so they must design a system that works with it, that yields to its power without breaking. And now, the clock is ticking louder than ever. They have one tidal window, a few precious hours of slack water, to anchor the spud legs of the first pier head and align the initial floating causeway. If they miss it, the current will swing, ripping their work apart before it can even begin. The 24-hour countdown has truly begun. The sea and the night have no memory. They swallow light, sound, and sweat without a trace. Out here, under a sky smeared with clouds and the faint glow of distant fires, there was only the work. Sparks flew from the welders' torches, a frantic Morse code against the dark. Each flash was a victory, each sizzle of hot metal hitting the cold English Channel a small, angry scream. Salt spray coated everything, blinding men, crusting on their lips, making the steel slick and treacherous. The air was thick with the tang of ozone and spent fuel. Acetylene bottles emptied with a final, mournful hiss, tossed aside to join the growing pile of refuse. You'd feel it before you saw it, the sting of hot slag on wet skin, a sudden sharp burn that you'd curse and then ignore. There was no time for pain. This wasn't chaos. It was a brutal, beautiful choreography. High above, the cranes, like skeletal beasts, swung massive sections of pier into place. Their groans were the bass notes in this symphony of construction. Down below, teams of Seabees and Army engineers worked in a frantic rhythm. You'd hear the ring of sledgehammers on steel, driving drift pins home, the sound echoing across the water. 1, 2, 3, asterisk, drive asterisk. Again, linesmen, hanging precariously over the surging waves, tested the chafing gear on the mooring lines, their gloved hands running over thick ropes, feeling for any weakness. On the floating pier heads, signalmen blinked their hooded lamps, guiding the hulking Rhino ferries that were edging into position, their engines a low growl. You saw humanity in the small, terrible details. A Seabee, his knuckles split open and bleeding from a slipped wrench, just wiped the blood on his trousers and picked the tool back up. You'd see an Army engineer, a kid barely out of basic, whispering a quick prayer over a pin that refused to seat, his face a mask of desperation under the bare bulb of a work light. The plans, the real plans, weren't the blueprints back at headquarters. They were the crude drawings scribbled on the side of a sea ration box when a pencil lead snapped, a diagram sketched in grease to show how to jury-rig a broken winch. The war hadn't forgotten us. Sporadic shelling from German guns still dug in inland sent plumes of water geysering into the sky, a reminder that the beach was still the edge of the world. The shells landed with a hollow asterisk crump asterisk, and for a moment, everyone would freeze. Then the hammering would start again, louder this time, angrier. Luftwaffe nuisance flights, lone raiders in the dark, would occasionally buzz overhead, their engines a menacing drone. Then the flak batteries on the beach would open up, stitching the sky with tracers, and the planes would scatter like startled birds. The beach itself was a graveyard of ambition-wrecked trucks, and half-tracks lay half-buried in the sand, their metal bones picked clean for spare parts. Nothing was wasted. And in the middle of it all, the harbor was starting to breathe. You could feel it under your feet. The giant spud legs of the pier heads had been driven deep into the sand, anchoring them to the seabed. With each swell, you could feel the entire structure move. The pier heads slid on their guides, rising and falling with the waves, a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale. The long causeways, the floating roadways connecting the pier heads to the shore, flexed and groaned. They were designed to give, to bend with the relentless power of the ocean, but never to break. It felt alive, a great steel lung taking its first breaths. There was a pulse to this place, a logistical heartbeat. The targets were everything. Tonnage of supplies per hour, number of vehicles disembarked by dawn. The commander's voice, crackling over the field telephones, was relentless. He wasn't asking. He was demanding. By sundown tomorrow, he'd said, the front lines had to feel this. Not just see it, but feel it. A river of steel, fuel, and ammunition had to start flowing, and we were the ones carving the riverbed. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, a fragile dawn began to break. The arc lights sputtered and died, revealing a world of steel and sea foam. The mist was thick, muffling sound, but then you'd hear it. The deep, mournful horns of the tugboats already maneuvering the next sections into place. And out there, circling patiently in the growing light, was the first LST, its engines a low, steady thudding, like the pulse of an approaching giant. The horizon is a steel-gray line, indistinguishable from the sea. After weeks of battling the elements, of wrestling steel and concrete into place, this is it, the moment of truth. All eyes are on the lead vessel, the first LST, a ghost emerging from the morning haze. Her hull is a roadmap of the storm she just fought through, streaked with rust and salt. Up on the bridge, you can almost feel the tension radiating from her captain. His knuckles are bone white, gripping the con as he nudges his massive ship toward the fragile pier. This isn't a gentle docking. It's a controlled collision with a structure that has never been tested like this before. The deep, rhythmic pulse of the LST's engines is the only sound against the roar of the surf. The swell, that relentless, breathing monster, begins to rise. The entire floating causeway lifts with it, a massive, articulated beast heaving in the water. For a terrifying second, it seems to climb higher than the LST's deck, then it crashes back down, spray flying everywhere. Stand by for mooring lines! The cry cuts through the air. Heaving lines snake across the gap, followed by the thick, heavy mooring ropes. They're pulled taut, taking the strain. You can hear them groaning, a high-pitched shriek of fiber stretched to its absolute limit. Every man on the pier and the ship holds his breath. The connection has to hold. It has to... Lin's parting. The shout is followed by a sound like a rifle shot. A mooring line, thick as a man's arm, snaps. It whips back across the deck with incredible force, a blur of motion. A deckhand goes down, a cry lost in the wind. There's no time to check on him. The LST's bow is already starting to swing away, pushed by the current, threatening to shear off the end of the pier. Panic flashes. A coxswain in a small, powerful Rhino ferry doesn't wait for an order. He slams his throttles forward, the engine screaming in protest as he rams his craft against the LST's steel plate, a tiny bulldog trying to muscle a giant back into position. On the pier, the massive spud legs, the anchors pinning this whole enterprise to the seabed, creak and groan under the immense twisting force. Out in the bay, a fleet of amphibious DUKWS bobs in the rough water. Engines idling, waiting for the signal to start the supply run. They look like corks in a bathtub, impossibly small against the churning sea. On the shore, behind the beach berm, the heavy equipment operators sit in their bulldozers. Their engines rumble, a promise of power ready to drag the first trucks out of the soft sand and surf if they get bogged down. The entire operation is a chain, and every single link is under a strain it was never designed for. The engineers who built this watch from the shore, their faces grim. They know the math. They know that if just one hinge pin shears under the load, the entire pier could unzip itself, section by section, torn apart by the waves. If a single deep water anchor drags on the seabed, the whole structure will slew sideways into the surf zone, collapsing into a worthless pile of scrap. Conflicting orders fly. Cut the stern anchor, let her swing with the tide. Another officer screams. Negative. Hold position. Burn the fuel, the captain roars back. A coxswain is ordered to sacrifice his Rhino, to wedge it between the pier and another drifting barge, a multi-ton fender to prevent a catastrophic collision. The tide is turning, far faster than the charts predicted, pulling with a vicious, unseen power. And on the horizon, the dark, bruised clouds of an approaching squall are gathering. A new threat promising more wind and higher waves. Time is gone. There are no more minutes to spare, only seconds. On the LST, a sound cuts through the chaos, the grinding hydraulics of the bow ramp. It begins its slow, agonizing descent. The steel plate inches down, reaching for the deck of the floating pier, which is still bucking and heaving beneath it. The gap is a churning maelstrom of white water. On the ramp, already in position, is the first M4 Sherman tank. Its engine is gunning, a deep, guttural roar of impatience. Its crew is buttoned up, ready to roll the second they get the word. The ramp continues to lower, 10 feet, 5. The steel edge is about to make contact. In this single, heart-stopping moment, everything hangs in the balance. The culmination of months of work, the lives of thousands of men, the success of the entire invasion, all depends on whether this connection holds, or if it all tears itself apart in a cataclysm of shattered steel and broken promises. The wind dies down. The sea, though still heaving, has lost its rage. On the Normandy coast, the silence is thick with the smell of salt water and ruin. The American Mulberry Harbor is gone, a tangled wreck of steel and concrete. But the fight isn't over, not even close. From the chaos, a new plan emerges, born not from blueprints, but from grit and desperation. This is the story of how they turned a disaster into a lifeline. Across the water, the British Mulberry at Arromanches, though damaged, still stands a testament to its more sheltered position. But for the Americans at Omaha Beach, there is no rebuilding. The cost in time and resources is too great. General Bradley makes the call. They will not reconstruct the artificial harbor. Instead, they will salvage, adapt, and create something new, something alive. It's a moment of brutal honesty. The grand design failed, but the mission must succeed. The solution is a masterpiece of improvisation. The Seabees and Army engineers men who had just watched their monumental creation get torn apart by the waves don't waste a moment on despair. They get to work. They salvage the causeways, those long floating roadways that connected the piers to the beach. They take the surviving sections, the ones that weren't twisted into scrap metal, and lash them together. They anchor them directly to the sand, creating improvised jetties. It's raw, it's ugly, but it's functional. The camera zooms in on the details. We see men wading chest deep in the cold surf, wrestling with massive steel pontoon cubes. They use Rhino ferries, those self-propelled barges, not just to shuttle cargo from ship to shore, but as mobile piers themselves, nudging right up to the beached landing craft. They sink old, battered ships, the blockships, in a careful arc to create a rudimentary breakwater, calming the waves just enough for the smaller vessels to work. It's a harbor built from spare parts and sheer will. Then, the payoff. The final section of a salvaged causeway, a long steel ramp, is maneuvered into place. With a groaning shudder of metal, it slams home, connecting a line of pontoons directly to the beach. For a tense moment, it sways, the entire pier bending with the rhythm of a large wave, riding the swell, and it holds. A collective, unspoken breath is released. A cheer goes up, quickly swallowed by the roar of an engine. The first Sherman tank clanks forward, its tracks biting into the steel decking. Then another. Then a convoy of 2.5-ton trucks, their beds heavy with crates and jerrycans. Pallets of ammunition stacked high are swung from ship to pier by crane, the ropes smoking with friction. You can almost smell the diesel fumes and hear the shouted counts as supplies are passed hand to hand, a human chain fueling the war effort. The The pier seems to breathe with the sea, a living artery pumping lifeblood into the invasion. The numbers are staggering. Within 24 hours of the storm's end, this improvised harbor is moving thousands of tons of supplies a day. It's enough. Enough fuel to keep the tank columns rolling inland, enough ammunition to feed the artillery, enough rations to sustain the hundreds of thousands of soldiers pushing deeper into France. There are no speeches, no medals handed out on the beach. It's just work. The quiet, relentless heroism of engineers and builders, solving a problem that no textbook had ever conceived of. This wasn't just about mechanics. It was a triumph of a certain mindset. Modular thinking, trust under extreme pressure, and the kind of rugged ingenuity that can look at a field of wreckage and see the raw materials for a miracle. The American Mulberry was gone, but in its place stood a living harbor, a network of pontoons, ferries, and sunken ships that would carry the immense burden of supply until the deep water port of Cherbourg could be captured and cleared. One young engineer, in a letter home, tried to capture the feeling of it all. He wrote that they didn't just fix a pier. They had, in his words, built a harbor out of tide and steel. They took the very forces that had defeated them, the relentless sea, and made it part of their solution. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest innovations aren't planned in boardrooms, but forged in the heart of a crisis. These are the stories that define the spirit of that generation. If you want to hear more incredible tales of ingenuity under fire from World War II, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.